Hi everybody. Here's a book I read with great profit back in 2007. Rodney Stark, The Rise of Christianity, rather. Stark was, at that point, professor of sociology and comparative religion at the University of Washington. This book caused a stir when it came out because it was going against the progressive tide in its explanation of the rise of Christianity, and I think not just every Christian, therefore, needs to bone up by ordering this book and making it part of their own library, but every person who's not a Christian out there who has deep antipathy, maybe, towards Christianity needs to read what Stark says about why Christianity took over the Roman Empire. Here's what was said at the time, the blurb on the front. Newsweek magazine, don't get higher profile than that, said, "A fresh, blunt, and highly persuasive account of how the West was won for Jesus." By the way, the subhead of the book, The Rise of Christianity, is How the Obscure Marginal Jesus Movement Became the Dominant Religious Force in the Western World in a Few Centuries. Kenneth Woodward goes on in that Newsweek review to say, Stark finds that Christians prospered the old-fashioned way by providing a better, happier, and more secure way of life. In the end, Stark concludes, Christians revitalized the Roman Empire. And Wayne Meeks of Yale University said this about the book. Anyone who is puzzled over Christianity's rise to dominance in the world, in the Roman Empire, must read this book. Here is theoretical brashness combined with disarming common sense, a capacious curiosity, and a most uncommon ability to tell a complicated story in simple prose. The reason I thought to do this now is because we are at the height of the COVID-19 crisis. Everything's in lockdown. Epidemic is on everybody's mind. Well, you'll be pleased to know that chapter 4 of this book is entitled Epidemics, Networks, and Conversion. And Stark is analyzing, as a sociologist, why it was that epidemics helped the rise of Christianity. He starts by talking about the first great wave of epidemics in the 160s when Marcus Aurelius was the Roman emperor. By the way, Marcus Aurelius was a strong opponent of Christianity, very wise man, mind you, very learned in philosophy, but a strong persecutor of the Christian church. So he starts his analysis in the year 165 during the reign of Marcus Aurelius. A devastating epidemic swept through the Roman Empire. Some medical historians suspect that it was the first appearance of smallpox in the West. But whatever the actual disease, it was lethal. During the 15-year duration of the epidemic, from a quarter to a third of the empire's population died from it, including Marcus Aurelius himself. In 180, by the way, in Vienna. Then in 251, so about 80 years later, a new and equally devastating epidemic again swept the empire, hitting the rural areas as hard as the cities. This time, it may have been measles. Both smallpox and measles can produce massive mortality when they strike a previously unexposed population. In his now classic and pioneering work on the impact of epidemics on history, Hans Zinser pointed out that, quote, again and again, the forward march of Roman power and world organization was interrupted by the only force against which political genius and military valor were utterly helpless, epidemic disease. And when it came, as though carried by storm clouds, all other things gave way, and men crouched in terror, abandoning all their quarrels, undertakings, and ambitions until the tempest had blown over. And sure enough, we find that that's exactly what's happened in the politics of the West since the coronavirus arrived a mere 2 or 3 months ago. He goes on. Cyprian, Dionysius, Eusebius, and other church fathers thought the epidemics made major contributions to the Christian cause. I think so too. In this chapter, I suggest that had classical society not been disrupted and demoralized by these catastrophes, Christianity might never have become so dominant a faith. To this end, I shall develop 3 theses. The first of these can be found in the writings of Cyprian, Bishop of Carthage. The epidemic swamped the explanatory and comforting capacities of paganism and of Hellenic philosophies. In contrast, Christianity offered a much more satisfactory account of why these terrible times had fallen upon humanity, and it projected a hopeful, even enthusiastic portrait of the future. The second, that is the second of his theses, is to be found in an Easter letter by Dionysius, who was the Bishop of Alexandria. Christian values of love and charity had, from the beginning, been translated into norms of social service and community solidarity. When disasters struck, the Christians were better able to cope, and this resulted in substantially higher rates of survival. This meant that in the aftermath of each epidemic, Christians made up a larger percentage of the population, even without new converts. Moreover, their noticeably better survival rate would have seemed a miracle to Christians and pagans alike, and this ought to have influenced conversion. My third thesis is an application of control theories of conformity. When an epidemic destroys a substantial proportion of a population, it leaves large numbers of people without the interpersonal attachments that had previously bound them to the conventional moral order. As mortality mounted during each of these epidemics, large numbers of people, especially pagans, would have lost the bonds that once might have restrained them from becoming Christians. Meanwhile, the superior rates of survival of Christian social networks would have provided pagans with a much greater probability of replacing their lost attachments with new ones to Christians. In this way, very substantial numbers of pagans would have been shifted from mainly pagan to mainly Christian social networks. In any era, such a shifting of social networks will result in religious conversions, as was outlined in a previous chapter of this book. Now he goes into a little bit more detail about the two waves of plagues. The plague of Galen back in around 165. He says that the Galen plague that took the life of, among others, the Emperor Marcus Aurelius, probably took down at least a quarter to a third of the population all around. And then about the second plague, 250 or so, he says almost a century later, a second terrible epidemic struck the Roman world. At its height, 5,000 people a day were reported to have died in the city of Rome alone. And for this epidemic, we have many contemporary reports, especially from Christian sources. Thus, Cyprian, Bishop of Carthage, wrote in 251 that many of us are dying from this plague and pestilence. Several years later, Dionysius, Bishop of Alexandria, wrote in an Easter message that out of the blue came this disease, a thing more frightful than any disaster whatever. Next time, in the next segment, we want to talk about the Christian and the pagan attitudes towards the epidemics, because they were vastly different. The Rise of Christianity by Rodney Stark.